The first thing I learned about reincarnation was that it had terrible ventilation. One minute, I was an ordinary guy arguing with a vending machine. The next, I had claws, a tail, and the sinking suspicion that I was not trapped inside an egg. I was the egg. AI Anime and Manga Originals presents Reborn as the Gloamstar Dragon. If you like original AI anime stories with monsters, magic, and one extremely sarcastic baby dragon, hit like, subscribe, and tell me in the comments what you would do if your first quest was escaping your own shell. Patreon members help keep the narration, subtitles, thumbnails, and rendering moving and get upcoming episodes before public release. Now, let us hatch. Chapter 1. Eggshell rent is too high. The first thing I learned about reincarnation was that it had terrible ventilation. I woke in the dark with my knees under my chin, my back pressed against a warm curved wall, and the strong suspicion that somebody had buried me in a ceramic jar. This was not on my schedule. My last memory had been an office hallway, a rain-slick window, and the heroic realization that the vending machine had stolen my coin again. There had been a flash outside. Someone had shouted. I had thought, with the deep wisdom of a 27-year-old man who had eaten convenience store noodles for dinner 3 nights in a row, that if I survived the day I was absolutely going to file a complaint. Then came heat, pressure, and a sound like the world folding itself shut. Now I was here. Here. Wherever here was, it smelled like warm stone, wet leaves, metal, and something faintly sweet that made my stomach twist with interest. I could hear my own breathing, except it was not quite my breathing. It rasped in little clicks. My chest moved too fast. My limbs were folded wrong. Here. A heavy rope-like thing kept twitching behind me, smacking the curved wall with soft little thumps. I tried to move my right knee. Something moved, but it was absolutely not a knee. Here. It scraped the wall above my face and made my whole body twist, which caused the rope thing behind me to smack the opposite side of the jar egg coffin with the confidence of a stagehand missing every cue. My shoulder bumped my chin. My chin bumped what I later learned was my chest. A foot, or possibly a very ambitious hand, kicked me in the side. There were too many limbs. This was not a philosophical complaint. I had done the standard human package for 27 years. 2 arms, 2 legs, a spine that only complained after bad chairs. I knew where everything was supposed to be. Now my body had apparently signed up for extra parts without consulting management. I flexed what felt like a finger and heard 5 tiny points scrape shell. I flexed what felt like another finger and kicked myself in the jaw. The important thing, I decided, was to remain calm and gather information like a rational adult. My stomach made a tiny predatory gurgle. Information gathered. I was scared, cramped, hungry, and one poorly aimed twitch away from losing an argument with my own anatomy. Do not panic, I told myself. The rope thing twitched again. I panicked. I shoved with both hands. Except hands apparently had been discontinued. 4 small claws scraped the wall in front of my face. They made a sharp, satisfying sound, like a fork dragged along dinnerware by someone with no respect for civilization. The wall shivered. A thin silver line opened in the dark. My brain did the reasonable thing and offered me 3 possible explanations. 1. I had been kidnapped by a cult that specialized in jars. 2. I had been buried alive inside a very expensive egg. 3. I was the egg. The wall cracked again. Nope, I tried to say. What came out was a hiss so tiny and offended that even I would not have taken myself seriously. The hiss vibrated through my skull. My mouth felt wrong, too long and too full of points. I touched my face with 1 claw and jabbed my own snout. I had a snout. Very calmly, with the dignity expected of a grown adult man, I screamed. The scream came out as a squeak. Somewhere nearby, something answered. Thump, not my thump. I froze. Thump, scratch, thump. Another curved wall, another egg, then another, a little farther away, tapping in a different rhythm. The sounds reached me through stone, shell, and air, accompanied by faint heartbeats like drums under blankets. Two lives pressed near mine, both small, both impatient. Oh, well, that was worse. If this was some sort of cosmic prank, it had props. The crack in front of me widened. Light spilled through, not bright enough to hurt, but enough to show the inside of my shell. The interior was silver, smooth, and flecked with tiny star-shaped specks. The outside, visible where my claws broke through, was glossy black. A pleasant warmth pulsed through it, like the last heat in a stone left beside a fire. It was beautiful. I would have appreciated it more if I were not wearing it. My stomach clenched. The sweet scent beyond the shell grew stronger, mingling with cold air, moss, and a mineral tang that settled on my tongue. My body knew what to do even if I did not. The next time I pushed, my shoulders rolled, my hind claws braced against the lower curve, and my tail shoved with alarming competence. There was a crisp pop, half the shell fell away. Moonlight poured over me. I tumbled out face first into a bed of glowing moss. For 3 full breaths, I did nothing except lie there with my snout buried in soft green light and consider suing the afterlife for unsafe delivery practices. Cold air stroked my back. Warm air rose from beneath the moss in slow vents. Somewhere overhead, wind moved through stone holes and made the cave sing in hollow notes. The smell of rain and snow blew in from a wide opening shaped like a broken crescent moon. I lifted my head. The world was enormous. The nest sat inside a mountain cavern cracked open to the night. The cave mouth curved overhead like a bitten moon, framing dark peaks in a sky scattered with silver clouds. Blue-white moss grew in thick pillows along shelves of black stone. Small flowers, pale as candle flames, pushed through cracks beside old bones worn smooth by time. Some bones were thin and bird-like. Others were the size of roof beams. Dragon bones, a calm part of my mind supplied. No thank you, the rest of me replied. The largest skull rested half-buried in moss along the far wall, its empty eye socket big enough for my entire former apartment's kitchen table. Ferns grew between the teeth. A vine heavy with white bell-shaped flowers had wrapped around one horn, making the dead thing look as if somebody had tried to improve it with interior decorating. It did not help. The Aerie had layers. A high shelf caught moonlight and scattered it down in pale strips. Lower hollows held pools so still they reflected stars from outside the cave. Wind moved through narrow holes in the stone and made different notes depending on which passage it touched. A low hum above, a thin whistle behind the nest, a soft breath from below where heat rose through cracks. The place was not just a cave, it was a nursery built by creatures who expected eggs to need warmth, shelter, moonlight, and enough dramatic bones to establish brand identity. I would have admired the planning more if my first sight of it had not involved my face in moss and my future family making ominous tapping noises. The nest itself was a basin of woven roots, dry grass, shed scales, and rounded stones that glowed amber where heat still lived inside them. Eggshell fragments glittered around me. Mine were black outside, silver within, the broken edges catching moonlight in starry lines. The 2 other eggs rested a short distance away, one red-brown and speckled like banked coals, the other pale blue-white with a sheen like frost. They were both shaking. I tried to stand. My legs, all 4 of them, held a private meeting and voted against it. Wealth for Shishin. I stepped with the front right leg and immediately forgot what the rear left leg was doing. My tail swung to correct my balance. It overcorrected. My oversized wings, which I had not noticed until that moment because apparently nobody gave me an owner's manual, flared open. I rose to a majestic height of perhaps 2 handspans. Then I fell sideways into my own shell. Excellent, a flawless debut. The red egg split with a crack like a nutshell under a boot. A blunt snout punched through. It was followed by a wet red face, 2 tiny horns, and a pair of orange eyes already squinting with pure accusation. The hatchling inside chewed the opening larger instead of pushing, because why solve a problem without biting it? He burst out, rolled once, and landed on his feet. Of course he did. Hife. He was stockier than me, with pebble-smooth red scales, an orange belly, and a head slightly too large for the rest of him. Smoke leaked from his nostrils in 2 offended threads. He opened his mouth and chomped down on the nearest object, which happened to be his own tail. He yelped, released it, and immediately tried to bite it again. Brilliant, I hissed. He looked at me. For a wild second, I thought he understood. Then he charged my face. We collided snout to snout. His teeth clicked against my cheek scales. I squeaked, he squeaked louder, and we both toppled into the moss. He smelled like hot copper, damp ash, and that fierce baby smell of milk without any milk involved. His mind was not empty. I could feel that much in the quick focus of his eyes, the way he tracked movement and heat. But he was not a person in the way I meant person, not yet. He was hunger, curiosity, teeth, and the firm belief that the world could be understood by putting it in his mouth. The pale egg cracked with more elegance. A tiny claw poked out, withdrew, poked out somewhere else, and made a neat line. The shell opened like a flower. A slender hatchling slid free in a spill of silver-blue membrane, pale scales gleaming almost white where the moss light touched them. Her horn tips were pearl pale. Her wings had a faint mint tint, thin and delicate, and she blinked at the world with large green eyes that missed nothing. She looked at me. She looked at the red hatchling gnawing on my wing. She looked at the pile of warm stones. Then she trotted over, picked up a small silver shell fragment in her mouth, and tucked it beneath one wing. We had a biter and a thief. Wonderful family. I tried to speak again, partly out of habit and partly because someone needed to establish order before the red one discovered cannibalism by accident. Stop biting me. Hirsch. My mouth could form neither consonants nor authority. My tongue was too thick. My throat clicked in a way that suggested it had been assembled by a committee of lizards. The red hatchling bit my wing again. I shoved him with one foreclaw. He flopped onto his back, paws in the air, then sprang upright with the delighted expression of a creature who had just invented wrestling. He tried a second charge immediately. This time I attempted strategy. I planted all 4 feet, lowered my head, and prepared to meet him with the firm dignity of an older brother establishing boundaries. My tail chose that moment to sweep under my own hind legs. Brakk hit me in the chest. I sat down on my tail. My wings burst open, caught a curtain of dangling moss, and pulled it over both of us like a blanket. We rolled together, squeaking and hissing, while the moss curtain glowed brighter around our flailing claws. For a moment I saw nothing except red scales, green light, and Brakk's mouth closing on anything that passed within range. He bit the moss, he bit a root, he bit the air with enthusiasm. He bit my horn tip and then looked offended that it was attached to me. I freed one foreclaw and booped his snout. The mighty red dragon blinked. Then he sneezed smoke directly into my face. It was not fire, it was barely smoke. More of a warm gray opinion. Still, it smelled like singed pepper and made my eyes water. Unbelievable, I hissed. Syla, who had not participated in the battle because she possessed the ancient warrior art of common sense, used our distraction to drag my largest silver shell fragment 3 whole body lengths closer to the warm stones. I respected her criminal discipline. I named him Brakk in my head. It fit. It had the same sound as a cooking pot dropped downstairs. The pale one watched us from beside the stones, perfectly still except for the slow curl of her tail around the silver fragment. She had already found the warmest place in the nest and the shiniest piece of property. I named her Syla because she looked like a sigh with claws. And me? And me? I looked down at myself. Anhokai. Black scales covered my forelegs, glossy and soft-edged, with thin silver rims along each scale. In the moss light, the silver looked like frost. In the moonlight, it became sharper, white as tiny blades. My claws were dark blue-black. My belly was smoky gray. When I blinked at a puddle gathered in a stone hollow, a face blinked back with huge dark blue eyes. Around each pupil were tiny pale rings, almost like stars caught in water. Cute, terrifyingly cute. The kind of cute that made people say foolish things like, "Look at the little danger lizard," right before losing a finger. I was also very, very small. This was a problem. In my previous life, I had been average height, average weight, and average at pretending I understood office budget meetings. I knew how to use a kettle, fill out a form, ignore spam calls, and buy fried chicken after a bad day. I did not know how to be a dragon. My stomach growled. Apparently, my new body did not care about my existential crisis unless it could be eaten. The sound made Brakk stop chewing on moss. Syla's head tilted. The scent of sweetness rose again, coming from the moss itself, the warm stones and the air. It was not food, not exactly. It was more like the smell of bread from a bakery you could not see. "Mana," my body whispered without words. That should have been impossible. Bodies did not whisper. Then again, bodies usually did not come with tails. I lowered my snout to the moss and sniffed. The green glow brightened where my breath touched it. A drop of dew trembled on a tiny leaf. It smelled like sugar, rain, and lightning. I licked it. Flee. My entire mouth lit up. Flee. Not literally, probably. But warmth ran down my throat and spread through my chest. My claws flexed. My wings shivered. The cavern became sharper around me. The heat in each stone. The living threads in the roots, the old cold resting in the bones. The two small hot hearts of my siblings. Flee. Brakk shouldered me aside and ate a mouthful of moss. Flee. Syla, with far more dignity, selected a dew-heavy patch and lapped only the brightest drops. She noticed me watching and paused with one tiny paw hovering over a glowing sprig. Then she very slowly placed that paw on the sprig and pulled it closer to herself. Ah yes, negotiation. Hafted. I tried to give her a stern look. This was complicated by my enormous eyes, round cheeks, and the fact that I still had moss stuck to one horn. Syla stared back, unreadable as a tiny moon. Brakk solved the tension by shoving his whole snout between us and inhaling the contested dew in one wet slurp. Hafted. Syla looked at him. Brakk looked proud. She nipped his tail. Hafted. He yelped, spun, tripped over my foreleg, and knocked all three of us into a shallow puddle beside the nest stone. Water splashed up. My wings slapped down. Syla emerged with her stolen shell fragments still clenched under one wing and not a drop on her nose, which felt unfair on a spiritual level. The puddle reflected us in a trembling cluster, black, red, pale, all eyes and soft horns and ridiculous bodies not yet large enough to deserve the word dragon without a courtesy discount. My reflection opened its mouth. "Herc," it said. "Fine, courtesy discount denied." I stared at them. Fine. They were babies. That realization landed heavier than the cave. Fine. Not reincarnated office workers, not fellow victims of a celestial paperwork error, not companions who would listen while I explained taxes, indoor plumbing, or why chewing your own tail was generally considered a beginner mistake. Brakk and Syla were newborns in the truest sense. Their thoughts, if they had thoughts, moved through hunger, warmth, scent, and instinct. I was the only adult in the nest. I was also the smallest adult I had ever met, including one particularly angry manager from accounting. Brakk sneezed smoke into the moss and startled himself backward. Syla used the distraction to steal another shiny bit of shell. Right, I hissed, because the sound was all I had. Apparently I am responsible for this. The cave answered with wind. I took inventory. Shelter? Yes. Unless the giant bones belong to a creature that might come back for them. Food, glowing moss dew, maybe. Water, puddles in rock hollows. Family, two tiny dragons with survival instincts ranging from bite the universe to embezzle the universe. Predators, Unknown. Shelter. My ability to handle predators. I had defeated one broken eggshell through persistence and falling. Promising. Shelter. A warm stone near the center of the nest caught my eye. It was smooth gray, about the size of my head, with amber light pulsing under the surface. Brakk had sprawled halfway across it, belly down, eyes closing. Syla had curled against its other side with her stolen shell tucked beneath her chin. Shelter. The sight did something rude to my chest. They looked safe. Shelter. Tiny, strange, toothy, impossible, but safe. Ifrordi. For the first time since waking in the shell, the panic loosened. I crawled closer, stepping slowly to avoid tripping over my own tail. Brakk opened one eye and made a grumbling sound. Syla shifted just enough to make room, though I suspected she was also checking whether my claws hid any valuables. Then the wind shifted. It came through the crescent mouth of the Aerie in a cold ribbon and rolled along the floor. Syla's head lifted first. Her nostrils fluttered. One delicate wing rose, catching the current. The stolen shell fragment glinted beneath her chin. No, I hissed automatically. She ignored me automatically. Syla stood, wobbling only once, and followed the draft toward the edge of the nest. The basin ended near a split in the stone where moonlight fell into a dark crack. It was not a cliff, exactly. It was worse than a cliff because it looked shallow enough to tempt a creature with no concept of falling and deep enough to make my entire spine turn cold. Brakk lifted his head, saw Syla moving, and decided motion meant game. This, I realized, was parenting, watching disaster schedule meetings with itself. I lunged. My front claws caught Syla's tail just as her forepaws reached the cracked stone. She chirped, more surprised than hurt. Brakk slammed into my side. My feet skidded. My wings flapped so hard they stirred glowing moss into the air. For one awful second, all three of us teetered, a stack of newborn bad ideas leaning toward the dark. The warm stone pulsed behind us. I twisted with everything I had. Newborn pair. My body did not move like a human body. It folded low, tail whipping out, claws digging into root and moss. Brakk's weight hit my shoulder. Syla's tail slipped through my teeth. I caught the base of her wing membrane with one paw, panicked, released before I tore it, and hooked my claws into the soft moss beside her instead. The moss held. We slid backward in a heap. Syla landed on my head. Brakk landed on my stomach. All the breath left me in a squeaking puff that would have shamed a rubber toy. For a heartbeat, nobody moved. Then Syla, still perched between my horns, leaned over and gently reclaimed the shell fragment she had dropped on my snout. Brakk bit my foreleg in celebration. I stared at the cave ceiling while my heart beat hard enough to shake my ribs. "You are both," I hissed, each word failing into breathy clicks. Very lucky I am unemployed. But Syla curled lower against my head for a moment before slipping down beside the warm stone, and Brakk's bite softened into a sleepy gum pressure rather than an attempted amputation. Maybe that meant nothing. Maybe it meant warmth, herd, nest, mine. It was enough to make the rude thing in my chest happen again. I pressed against the warm stone. Heat seeped through my scales. My eyes drooped. Maybe, I thought, this could work. Maybe I had died and woken as a monster in a mountain cave, but the cave was warm. Maybe the world outside could wait. Maybe I could learn to walk, learn to eat moss without looking tragic, learn to keep Brakk from biting anything load-bearing and Syla from stealing objects required for structural stability. I even attempted nest management. Stirred. This was not an official title. Nobody handed me a clipboard. I simply noticed one sharp eggshell shard near Brakk's belly, and because I was now apparently the adult supervision, tried to move it away before he rolled onto it. The shard was light. My claws were not delicate. Stirred. I flicked it too hard, sent it spinning into the air, and watched Syla's head follow it with the terrifying focus of a professional thief spotting payroll. She sprang. Brakk sprang because Syla sprang. I sprang because if everyone else was springing, disaster was clearly in progress. We collided over the shell shard in a pile of wings, tails, and tiny outraged noises. By the end, Brakk had a strip of moss stuck to his forehead. Syla had the shard under one wing, and I had somehow managed to sit in the only cold puddle within 10 paces. This, I decided, was why adults needed coffee. I did not have coffee. I had moss dew, a bruised tail, and 2 siblings who considered my personal space a public resource. Still, when Brakk shook the moss strip loose and Syla tucked herself against the warm stone with her stolen prize, the nest looked a little less dangerous than before. That counted. Maybe a quiet life was still possible. Heard. The universe, having excellent comic timing and a personal grudge, chose that moment to blow a horn. The sound came from outside the crescent opening, low and metallic. It bounced through the Aerie, scattered dust from the stone ceiling, and made all 3 of us jerk upright. Brakk hissed. Syla froze. I smelled it a heartbeat later. Smoke, oil, leather, sweat, humans. Voices echoed up the mountain path beyond the cave, distorted by wind but unmistakable. One distorted voice said, "Nest still warm." Heard. Another warned, "Careful, shells intact means fresh cores." Heard. A third ordered, "Move before the dam circles back." My blood went cold. I had heard human speech, not as sounds, not as meaningless noise. Words, clear, ordinary, terrible words. Brakk puffed smoke at the cave mouth and wobbled on his feet. Syla backed toward the warm stone, one wing half spread over her stolen silver fragment. Neither of them understood what the voices meant. How could they? They only knew danger had entered the air. I knew more. Fresh cores, shells intact. Move before the dam circles back. Not rescuers then, not confused hikers, not friendly mountain people with blankets and a welcome basket for newly hatched reptiles. Hunters. My body crouched before I told it to. The moss glow dimmed under my shadow. Something gathered in the back of my throat, cold and sweet, then vanished when fear squeezed my chest too tight. The voices grew louder. Metal scraped stone. At the mouth of the Aerie, a boot stepped into the moonlight. It was human-sized, mud-caked, and armored over the toe. It came down on one of my black eggshell fragments and crushed it with a sound like a star breaking. I had been alive for less than an hour, and someone was already behind on their rent. Chapter 2, The Brave and Noble Art of Running Away. There are many ways to greet a newborn. Blankets are traditional, gentle voices perhaps, a warm drink for whoever did all the difficult work of existing for the first time. The armored man at the mouth of the Aerie chose a spear. Its steel head slid into the moonlight, long and leaf-shaped, with scratches along the edge and a smear of something dark near the socket. Behind it came a leather-gloved hand, a forearm wrapped in boiled hide, and a man whose expression had the bright, practical focus of someone inspecting merchandise. He looked at my crushed eggshell. He looked at me. He smiled. That was when I realized cute did not equal safe. 3 hatchlings, he called over his shoulder. Fresh, dams gone. Brakk, possessed by the spirit of poor decision-making, charged him. "No," I hissed, which remained a useless sound in every language. My red idiot brother crossed the nest in a wobbly sprint, wings flapping, tail high, mouth open. He was brave, I would give him that. Brave in the way a thrown brick is brave. The spearman lowered the shaft, not to stab yet, but to pin. Brakk ducked under it by accident and bit the man's boot. The entire cave paused. Brakk clamped down with all the force a newborn dragon could offer, which was apparently enough to make a grown adventurer hop backward and swear with feeling. The spearman. This offended the next person through the cave mouth, a broad-shouldered woman with a lantern hooked to her belt and a short axe in each hand. It's a dragon. That is what the front half does. Behind her came 2 more, a narrow man in a green cloak carrying a crossbow, and a gray-bearded man with a satchel of iron hooks and glass jars. All four wore the same mark somewhere on their gear, a red wax seal stamped over a strip of slate-gray leather. The mark showed a pine branch crossed with a blade. They did not rush in all at once. That was the part that made my skin prickle under the scales. The spearman stayed low and angled his weapon across the mouth of the nest, blocking the obvious exit. The woman with the lantern swept the light from shell to shell, counting. The crossbowman stepped onto a flat stone with a clean line of sight but did not fire until he had room. The gray-bearded man knelt just inside the cave and set 2 glass jars on the ground with careful little clinks. Staging. Storage. A word from my old office life drifted up, absurd and useless. We used staging for conference rooms, product demos, and that one emergency birthday party for a director who hated surprises but loved being feared. These people used it for baby dragons. Outside the crescent opening, more movement scraped against stone. Pack frames. Rope. A second lantern shielded under a hood. A coil of chain dragged once, then went still. Whoever had climbed the path with these 4 had stopped just out of sight, leaving the practiced ones to enter first. My new nose sorted their smells before I could stop it. Oiled bowstring, old sweat in wool, copper wire, dried blood on leather, pine pitch used to seal boot seams, fierce sour breath held behind clenched teeth. This was not a panic. This was a harvest. Guild work, my mind guessed from the way they moved. Not thieves stumbling into a nest. Not starving villagers desperate enough to rob a miracle. Paid hunters, organized, equipped, probably with forms. Somehow the idea of paperwork made them more terrifying. The woman lifted her lantern. Warm yellow light rolled over the nest and caught on the black shells scattered around me. My silver-edged scales flashed. The crossbowman's face changed. It was not surprise. Surprise would have been wide eyes and a step back. This was recognition. "No," he said softly. The gray-bearded man turned. "What?" The crossbowman said. "Look at the black one." I lowered myself by instinct, claws sinking into moss. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my wing joints. The lantern swayed closer. "Black shell," the crossbowman whispered. "Silver lining, star rings in the eyes." I did not like how carefully he counted those facts. The woman stopped smiling. Gloamstar. The word struck the cave like another horn. I had no memory for it, no helpful human life association, yet my body knew enough to go cold. The moss under my claws dimmed, the air behind my teeth tasted suddenly sweet like metal dipped in honey. The spearman tried to shake Brakk off his boot. Brakk growled around the leather, very proud of himself. "Gloamstar is old wives' panic," the spearman said, though his voice had climbed higher. "It's a hatchling." "A hatchling that grows," said the crossbowman. "Rare shell alone pays triple." The gray-bearded man muttered and began opening his satchel. Glass jars clinked. "Core pays more if we keep it clean." Core. There it was again. Not scales, not proof, not relocation. Core. My stomach rolled. Sures. I looked at Brakk with his teeth in a boot, and Syla crouched beside the warm stone, pale as moonlit ice, the little silver shell fragment still tucked under one wing. They did not know what the humans meant. They only knew threat, light, metal, and the sharp smell of fear pouring from people who had chosen to come here anyway. The woman stepped into the nest. "Net first. Do not crack the red one if you can help it. Blue-white might be windblood, valuable." Syla's pupils thinned. The woman reached for a coil at her belt. Syla backed into the warm stone and went very still. That was how I learned my tiny sister had 2 modes, thrift and statue. Her pale body flattened low enough that her wing membranes brushed the moss. The silver shell fragment vanished beneath one elbow. Only her eyes moved, tracking the woman's hands, the coil, the lantern hook, the dangling row of little metal tokens at the woman's belt. Her fear smelled thin and cold, but her focus cut through it like a needle. Brakk, on the other hand, had no modes. Brakk was a mode. He shook the spearman's boot like a determined laundry service. Smoke puffed from his nose in angry little bursts. The spearman swore, tried to pry him off with the butt of the spear, and only succeeded in giving Brakk a second object to chew. "Red's lively," the gray-bearded man said. "Red's an idiot," I hissed, though only the moss appreciated my accuracy. The man opened a padded leather roll. Inside lay tools narrow and shining, hooked clamps, bone needles, little knives with curved tips, and a flat brass disc etched with circles. The disc hummed when he touched it. My claws flexed hard enough to tear moss. "Core sense after net," the gray-bearded man said. "Do not waste a jar on cracked stock." Cracked stock. Somewhere deep inside me, an adult human who had once apologized to copy machines because it felt polite stopped being frightened and became very, very angry. I moved. It was not heroic. Let us be honest about that. I did not make a noble calculation, weigh justice against safety, and decide to become a tiny guardian of monster kind. My thoughts were mostly a panic string of no, with a side note that I still did not understand how elbows worked. But my body crossed the moss between Syla and the woman. The woman's eyebrows rose. "Oh, it postures." I opened my mouth to roar. My throat produced a hiccup. A puff of black-violet shadow popped from my snout and drifted into the lantern light. It should have been embarrassing. It was roughly the size of a plum and had all the menace of a sneeze. Then the lantern flame shrank, not blew out, shrank. The yellow light folded inward as if something had swallowed the brightest part. Silver motes spun at the edge of the dark puff. The cave shadows deepened. The woman's face went pale. The tiny cloud vanished. The lantern flared back with a sputter. Everyone stared at me. Sortu. I stared back, equally alarmed. So, apparently I could burp darkness. Useful, perhaps, if I ever needed to ruin a romantic dinner. "Back," the crossbowman said. He lifted his weapon. "Back now, Sortu." The spearman finally kicked free of Brakk. Brakk bounced across the moss, rolled into a heap of shells, and sprang up with a triumphant squeal as if he had won the war. The gray-bearded man pulled a hooked net from his satchel. Its cords were woven with dull copper threads that smelled bitter like old coins and dead leaves. My instincts hated it. The woman's fear hardened into anger. "It is a baby, net it." Midway through my second hour of life, I learned something important about humans in this world. They were not confused predators. Predators killed because they were hungry, frightened, or defending territory. These people had climbed a mountain, waited for a dragon mother to leave, brought nets sized for infants, and discussed the clean removal of our cores with the tidy efficiency of craftsmen around a workbench. They were afraid, yes. I could smell it under the oil and leather, but fear was not stopping them. Fear was part of the job. Hypecr. Outside, the unseen helpers began working with the same awful calm. A rope hissed over stone. Someone hammered a spike into the path beyond the cave mouth. Another voice counted under its breath, marking intervals I did not understand until the spearman glanced back and said, "2 lines only. Hypecr. Damn returns, we drop the lower hook and run." They had planned for our mother. The thought opened a cold space under my ribs. Rituhifris. Somewhere beyond the mountain, there was probably a dragon large enough to make these people whisper. Large enough that her absence mattered. Large enough that the nest had been watched, timed, and entered in the narrow window between her leaving and returning. I did not know her. I had no memory of a mother in this life beyond shell warmth and the carefully built nest around us. But the warm stones, the moss basin, the tucked away eggs, the wind holes shaped to breathe over us. All of it suddenly felt like a hand that had stepped away for one moment too long. And these people had been waiting for that. The crossbow bolt snapped through the air. It struck the moss inches from my foreclaw. A metal barb sank into the nest and hissed as copper threads unfolded from it like little roots. My body moved before thought arrived. I lunged sideways, slammed into Syla, and knocked her toward the back of the nest. She made a breathy chirp of protest. The silver shell fragment flew from beneath her wings, skipped across stone, and flashed under the spearman's heel. Syla's eyes locked on it. No, I hissed at her, because apparently I had chosen a language of personal defeat. She darted anyway. Of course she did. The next few breaths became chaos. Brakk charged the spearman again, this time with smoke streaming from both nostrils. The spearman used the shaft to shove him away. Brakk bit the wood. The woman threw her net. I ducked, tripped over my own tail, and somehow the net passed over my head and landed on the warm stone instead. Copper threads sparked against the amber glow. For a heartbeat, we all saw exactly how bad that was. The warm stone did not glow like a lantern. Its light lived under the surface, slow and steady, a sleeping ember for eggs and newborn bones. When the copper net touched it, amber lines shot through the cords. The moss around the stone curled inward. Heat snapped up in a breath so sharp it singed the woman's sleeve. Syla darted under the net's edge, not away from danger, toward shiny danger. My sister had priorities, and every single one of them was going to age me. I lunged after her, but Brakk's tail whipped across my snout. The spearman lifted the shaft with Brakk still attached and swung him sideways by accident. Brakk released the wood, flew in a red blur, bounced off the woman's shin, and rolled directly into Syla's path. The two collided. Syla made a sound like an offended flute. Brakk sneezed smoke. The woman's lantern swung down. Light flashed off a small silver shape as one of the tokens from her belt snapped loose and skittered across the moss. Syla's entire face changed to floor. If she had been able to speak, I am certain she would have said mine. She pounced. The crossbow man saw the movement and brought his weapon around. I threw myself between him and the pale blur because apparently my new life consisted of being a very small door. The bolt grazed over my back. Wind from it flattened my ear fins. It struck an eggshell shard behind me and pinned it to the moss with a copper root hiss. I learned two things at once. First, crossbow bolts were much faster in person than in any reasonable story. Second, my body could make sounds no adult man should ever be associated with. The cave groaned, not loud, not dramatic, a deep complaint beneath the nest. The woman heard it too. Her boots shifted. The crossbow man swore, "Those vents are load warm. Do not bind the stones." "Then stop missing," she snapped. Syla reached the fallen silver fragment. It was not a shell piece. In the lantern light I saw it clearly. A small charm from the woman's belt, likely torn loose by the net throw. Silver, flat, etched with a pine branch mark and a crescent notch along one side. Syla snatched it in her mouth with the fierce satisfaction of a thief completing a sacred duty. Then she looked at me as if to ask, "Now what?" A good question. I had no weapons, no speech, no plan, and a darkness hiccup that had impressed everyone except the part of the universe responsible for our immediate survival. The nest's back wall, however, held a crack I had barely noticed before. Cold air seeped through it. The crack was narrow, but small bodies could fit. Beyond it came a faint whistling sound. Wind tunnel. Moonbreak Aerie had a back door. I shoved Syla toward it. She resisted for the length of time required to make sure the silver charm stayed in her mouth, then slipped into the crack like water. Her pale tail vanished first, then flicked back out and slapped the stone. I stared. Syla slapped it again, harder. Oh, she was calling us now. Of course, the quiet one had developed a communication method before I had successfully developed walking. The wind tunnel breathed around her, tugging loose moss and shell dust through the narrow opening. It smelled of cold cliff air, wet pine, and the impossible open space beyond the cave. The crack was barely wide enough for my shoulders. For the hunters, it was useless. For us, it was salvation with splinters. Brakk did not see it. Brakk was busy trying to bite the spear in half, and the spearman was busy discovering that newborn dragons had no respect for equipment budgets. "Red next," the gray-bearded man snapped. "Block the crack." The woman dropped her burned net and drew an axe. Syla's tail slapped the stone a third time, more frantic. I ran at Brakk. Windblood's running, the crossbowman barked. The spearman pivoted. Brakk still had his teeth in the spear shaft. I barreled into him from the side. He released the wood with an indignant squeak and tumbled toward the crack. The spearman's boot came down between us. I saw the soul. I saw the crushed black shell stuck in its tread. I saw my own silver-lined fragments ground into mud. Something in my chest went sharp. I leaped at the boot. Not because I thought I could win, because if he stepped into that crack before Brakk passed through it, my idiot brother would turn around and bite him again. Brakk was many things. Sensible was not currently among them. My claws struck leather. My teeth closed on a strap. It tasted like dirt, sweat, and metal polish. The man yelled and kicked. I held on. For perhaps 2 glorious seconds, I was a terrifying creature of legend. Then he kicked harder, and I became a thrown sock with wings. I hit a stone shelf. Pain flashed white through my shoulder. The cave spun. The lantern flame smeared into a yellow arc. Brakk, bless his empty little head, charged back toward me. No. I dragged myself upright. My left wing hung wrong. The cold, sweet pressure gathered again in my throat, stronger than before, fed by fear, anger, and the sight of Brakk turning away from safety because I was down. The woman raised her axe. I hiccuped. This time the shadow burst wider. Black-violet vapor rolled across the moss, edged in a silver corona. It did not strike anyone. It simply passed through the lantern light, the copper net, and the wax seals on the hunter's gear. The red wax marks dimmed. The copper threads in the net went slack. The lantern guttered until only a pin of flame remained. In that sudden dark, Brakk's orange eyes glowed beside mine. I shoved him with my whole body. Go. Maybe he understood the shove. Maybe instinct heard the wind. Maybe he simply noticed Syla was escaping and refused to be left behind. Whatever the reason, he scrambled into the crack, his red tail vanishing after Syla's pale one. Relief hit me so hard I nearly collapsed. It lasted less than a breath. From inside the tunnel came a crash, a hiss from Syla, and Brakk's delighted squeal. They were alive. They were also apparently turning the escape route into a family wrestling corridor. I almost laughed. It came out as a ragged click, half terror and half something dangerously close to love. The feeling was inconvenient. I had known these ridiculous creatures for less time than some meetings in my previous life, but the sight of their tails vanishing into that crack had rearranged me. I could not leave them. I could not follow fast enough. I could only make sure nothing with boots got in after them. The spearman lunged for the opening. I put myself in front of him again. Small body, huge bad idea. Still though, the boot filled my vision. I spread my wings because some instinct insisted larger was better, and my wings chose that moment to snag on a rib bone jutting from the nest wall. I jerked sideways, stumbled, and accidentally looked like I had dodged with supernatural precision. The spearman swore and checked his swing. Excellent. I had discovered advanced combat, being too clumsy to predict. Then the mountain answered all our noise. Still, the warm stone bound under the net split with a heavy crack. Amber light flared from inside it. Heat rushed upward. The roots woven through the nest snapped one after another, each sound sharp as a breaking bowstring. Out, the crossbowman shouted. The shelf is going. The nest tilted. Still though. All at once, the basin that had held us since before birth became a slide of moss, shells, stones, bones, hunters, and bad decisions. I scrambled toward the crack. The world tilted just enough to turn every loose thing into a weapon. Eggshells skated over moss in glittering black and silver arcs. A warm stone rolled past my shoulder, trailing amber sparks. One of the gray-bearded man's jars bounced, cracked, and spilled a sharp herbal stink that made my eyes water. The woman's lantern swung from its hook and painted the cave in mad yellow slices. Brakk's red tail disappearing, Syla's pale wing flashing once in the tunnel, the crossbow man's green cloak snapping as he grabbed for a root. "Leave them," the woman shouted, "shell and black core first." There was that word again, core. It should have meant something abstract, a category, a monster part, a line item on whatever guild forms these people filed after murdering infants in a cave. Instead, it landed in me as a hand reaching through scales for the hot little center of my life. I dug my claws into the moss and tried to pull myself uphill. My claws tore through it. The cracked nest lurched. For an instant, I saw the tunnel mouth ahead, small and dark, with Syla's stolen silver charm catching one last spark of lantern light between her teeth before the bend swallowed her. A hand grabbed my tail. The gray-bearded man had me. His fingers locked around the base of my tail with professional cruelty. A glass jar swung from his other hand, its lid etched with little ward marks. Up close, he smelled of stale herbs and old blood. The gray-bearded man shouted, "Got the black one!" Panic erased everything else. My wings beat uselessly. My claws scraped moss. My tail felt like it would tear from my spine. The back crack was only a few body lengths away, but Brakk and Syla were gone, and the nest floor was collapsing under us. The gray-bearded man dragged me toward the jar. No, I twisted and bit him. Shorger. My teeth sank into his glove, not deep enough to pierce skin, but enough to surprise him. He jerked, his grip loosened. The nest lurched again. He did not let go completely, so I did the only thing a dignified, reincarnated adult could do. I became a problem. Stew it. I twisted, kicked, flapped, and made every loose joint in my new body file a complaint at once. My hind claws scraped his wrist. My tail lashed. My teeth found the seam between glove and sleeve. He hissed in pain. Stew it. The jar in his other hand slipped, bounced off a stone, and rolled away into the collapsing moss. The gray-bearded man snarled, "Stop squirming, you little omen." Omen, not baby, not creature, not even monster, a warning sign. Stew it. The word would have been funny if I had not been dangling above a breaking mountain with my siblings vanishing into darkness and a stranger trying to fit my future into a jar. I bit harder. The world dropped. The stone shelf beneath us sheared away with a sound like thunder swallowed inside the mountain. The gray-bearded man vanished upward as I fell through a curtain of moss and dust. Or I vanished downward. Direction became a rumor. I hit a sloped chute of damp green growth, bounced off a root, spun, and saw the back tunnel for half a heartbeat. Two silhouettes flashed there, red and pale, tumbling through cold air in a different direction. Brakk, Syla. Then the rock between us collapsed. Dust sealed the view. I tried to call them. Only a cracked hiss came out. The chute spat me into open night. For one beautiful, stupid instant, I was flying. My wings snapped wide, catching moonlight. The wind filled them. The forest spread below, vast and green-black, its treetops silvered by clouds. Mountain cliffs fell away behind me. The air smelled of rain, sap, and distant flowers. Then my left wing screamed with pain, folded wrong, and I remembered that flying usually required practice. I fell. Branches slapped me, leaves filled my mouth. A vine caught my hind legs, stretched, and launched me sideways with the precision of a cruel instructor. I crashed through a canopy of broad leaves and landed in a cushion of ferns so wet they exploded around me in cold droplets. For a while I lay there. The forest hummed, not metaphorically. It hummed with insects, dripping water, root creaks, tiny heartbeats, and the deep, slow pulse of mana moving under the soil. Green gold light flickered between leaves. Mushrooms glowed in pink and blue clusters along fallen logs. Huge roots arched over the ground like the backs of sleeping beasts. The Tanglewood Frontier, I would learn later. At the time I called it, less poetically, the place where everything hurt. My left wing throbbed. My ribs ached. Moss stuck to my snout. My tail had a hand-shaped bruise. My shell fragments were gone, my warm nest was gone, and my siblings were somewhere beyond a collapsed mountain tunnel with no adult mind to keep Brakk from charging Veyr and Syla from stealing cursed jewelry. I forced myself to stand. One leg gave out. I stood again. From high above, faint through stone and distance, human voices carried. One distant voice shouted, "Tracks down the chute." Another answered, "Forget the red and windblood, the black one first." A colder voice said, "If it is Gloamstar, we kill it before dawn." The forest around me suddenly seemed much too large. I took one step under a root, then another. The brave and noble art of running away, I decided, was underrated by history. Ren made it out of the Aerie. Barely. His brother and sister are lost somewhere beyond a collapsed mountain. His wing is hurt, and the humans hunting him have just decided the black hatchling dies first. Next time on Reborn as the Gloamstar Dragon, survival gets stranger, the forest gets meaner, and the first human with snacks may be the most dangerous discovery of all. Watch episode 2 when it is ready, subscribe for the full story, and drop a comment with your favorite moment from the hatchling disaster. Patreon members help support the AI narration, subtitles, thumbnails, and renders, and get upcoming episodes early. AI anime and manga originals will see you in the Tanglewood.